Okay. Hi, Falteros. Welcome to my new YouTube channel and podcast called Away with the Fae. I have been trying to film this video for hours, I would say 3 hours. I have the most basic setup here. That is my tripod, my official tripod. I'll get a better one. If all of this goes well, I will get a better one. But I just wanted to try my hand at some YouTube content, because I know a lot of people on TikTok have been telling me that they would really like to follow me on YouTube or like on a podcast. And I have been tending towards like longer form content recently, so I was like, okay, just sit down and do a YouTube video. But it's so far it's been a mess. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. I wanted to talk today about the witch trials of Ireland, or lack thereof. So today, right, it's the 3rd of November. It marks the 700-year anniversary of Petrolina of Meath. Now, basically, Petrolina of Meath, she was the maid of a woman called Alice Keitler, I believe it's pronounced, who was accused of witchcraft in the 14th century. Now, she was accused of witchcraft by a British, oh my God, what do you call them? Not a priest, the other one. Bishop. And this was kind of at the beginning of like the witch hunt craze. So Europe was like starting to get into witch hunts, but this was the first one in all of England and Ireland. But basically this woman Alice was accused of being a witch by this British bishop. And she fled the country, she got out, but her maid was not so lucky. And on this day, the 3rd of November, 700 years ago, she was tortured and burned at the stake for witchcraft. Now, this particular case, it's not that it was the first case in Europe, but it was a really... important's definitely the wrong word. It was a really influential case as far as witch hunts and witch executions went. Because it was so well documented, it informed the writing of Malleus Maleficarum, which translates as the Hammer of Witches, which was written by a German clergyman. And basically what that was effectively a how-to guide on how to carry out witch hunts, torture and executions. So this case, although it wasn't the first witch trial case in Europe, it was a very fundamental one to what followed in the 14th to 17th century Europe, which was effectively hunting, the execution and the burning of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, predominantly women, let's face it, let's call a spade, as witches. Now, interestingly, and this is what I'm going to go into a little bit in today's video, Ireland, although we did have this very foundational witch trial and witch execution case, Ireland really wasn't down for witch burnings. It never caught on here like it did in the rest of Europe. Various sources say different things, but sources generally cite anywhere from 1 to 30, 40 witch executions in Ireland. Now, we did have imprisonment of, so-called witches, but considering the volume of people that were prosecuted as witches in Europe, we're talking tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Ireland's witch hunt legacy is absolutely incomparable. And it might initially seem quite surprising, because Ireland at the time was a Catholic country, an extremely Christian and extremely Catholic country. And the Christian and Catholic Church was really beginning to take a hold on the country and on the people. But there's really good reason that witch burnings just never really reached the level of hysteria that they did in the rest of Europe, and that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now. So to understand why Ireland was really just not down with the idea of burning witches, you need to understand kind of two fundamental things about Ireland. One is our pagan history and the other is our early Christian history, and those are massively important and massively foundational in why we didn't really take part in witch burnings. We have a predominantly Celtic history. Now, Ireland was invaded by plenty of other peoples. You had the Vikings, you had more recently the British, for example, who colonised Ireland for quite some time. But generally speaking, our history is considered to be predominantly Celtic. We have a lot of Celtic art, the Irish language is a Celtic language, and we have a lot of Celtic influences for our holidays and festivals and all the rest of it, right? So the Celts then are a really important part of this story and in understanding the psychology of why the Irish people were not interested in witch burnings, witch executions, etc. Oh God, I've got someone else going by my door. Okay, I should really close that window. Anyway, it's fine. So, right, you had the Celtic people, they came to Ireland, and the story goes that they drove out the people who were already there, who were called the Tua de Danann. Now, the Tua de Danann effectively translates as the people of the goddess Danu. Now, we do believe that the Danu part of that translation was added later by Christian monks, because the Tuatha is what they would have originally been known as, but the Tuatha is what Christian monks called the Israelites at the time. So in order to not kind of mix up those two very different things in their writings, they added on Danu, the goddess Danu. They added that aspect to the Tuatha De Danann. But yeah, effectively what it means is the Tuatha are the people of God, or God-like people. So the Tuatha De Danann effectively were really early Celtic gods. Now the story goes that when the Celts arrived in Ireland, they drove the Tuatha De Danann out of the country. But the Tuatha De Danann really didn't want to leave. So what they did instead was they retreated into the hills, retreated into the mounds, the trees of the land, retreated to the other world, to the land of Tir na Nog, etc. And that's where they still live to this day. So you might be thinking, okay, but what does that have to do with witchcraft? What does it have to do with fairies? One other important thing to understand is that the Celts had druids, they also had witches. Cailleachs is what they would have been known as. And Cailleach, it means hag. If you look up the etymology of hag, English word hag actually just comes from the German word hexa, which does translate as witch. So the Celts had not only druids but witches, and both would practice magic. So here's where it gets really interesting. So when Christian monks first came to Ireland, they did something that a lot of Christian leaders in Europe weren't doing, and that is that they incorporated the Irish and the pagan culture into their writings and into their storytelling. This is really, really fundamental to our Irish history and our Irish folklore, because what it means is that Ireland to this day actually has some of the best preserved written Celtic folklore in the world, and that is thanks to these Christian monks. The reason that Irish Christian monks preserve this Celtic folklore, this pagan kind of way of living, is because they were set up quite differently to Roman Christians. So Roman Christians were set up as a diocese, and they had kind of a leader up at the top in the form of the Pope. But what it meant was that Christian ideology was much more aligned in different parts of Europe under this kind of one leader. Whereas what Ireland had was monasteries, and these were basically just small little settlements scattered across the country, and that didn't have as much or a huge amount of interaction with one another, and certainly didn't have the same amount of coordinated alignment and interaction with one another. So this was extremely fundamental in how early Irish Christianity developed, because what Irish monks were doing that European Christians were not doing was they were documenting and incorporating pagan practices and pagan culture into their writing. So one kind of fundamental way that early Irish Christian monks incorporated the Tuatha De Danann into their Christian teachings was to say that you can still worship these gods, right? They're not gods anymore. They're deities, they're saints, and they're fairies. But you can still worship them. You have to worship our God as your main God, right? But these guys, these are secondary characters, and you can worship them as well. So the Irish people it kind of quite easily accepted this Christianity, because it didn't look all that different from their pagan ways, right? So there is a school of thought that says that the Danan are our fairies. Aren't fairies from your fairy tale books. Like, these guys are irked. These guys are not happy with being kind of exiled into the mounds, the trees, and the other world. So Irish people did a lot, and some still do a lot, to appease these fairies. Because you have to remember, these guys aren't like, these can be quite mischievous, quite nasty characters. We have what is known as a changeling, which is where a fairy will effectively kidnap your baby and replace it with this changeling, this fairy baby, this very sickly, unwell replacement, right? And that may even end up passing away. And this lore was probably used to explain the deaths of young babies back in the day, when we wouldn't really have had any kind of scientific explanation for them. Fairies were also used to explain mental illness. So if someone suffered from something like schizophrenia, for example, you might say that that the fairies got them, or that they were away with the fairies. Away with the fairies being an example of a very commonly used kind of Irish phrase, which just means that your mind is elsewhere, basically, and it all kind of goes back to this idea of fairies, fairies stealing children, kidnapping people, taking people to the other world. And the other thing that fairies would do in Ireland is, at transition points of the year, so say Bealtaine and Samhain, for example, Samhain being our modern day Halloween, they would cross over, so to speak, from Tirnanog, from the other world, into our world. And those were times of the year where the veil between both of those worlds was considered as being very thin. So these fairies would cross over. And one of the reasons that we have the tradition of dressing up for Halloween is so that because this is a Samhain tradition, this is a traditional Celtic practice, and one of the reasons we do that is to blend in with the dead, and also the fairies, pukas, banshees, etc., that would supposedly be walking the earth amongst us on Samhain, and Ia Hauna, which is Halloween night. So these guys weren't to be messed with. That's a little taste of our fairy folklore. And because early Christian monks incorporated that folklore into their writings, their teachings, etc., that allowed the local people to be both Christian and also effectively still kind of pagan. The other really cool thing that you can see as well from this period is the Book of Kells. So this is an Irish kind of Scottish book. It's the four Gospels, basically, but it's written in insular script. So first of all, it's kind of the Roman script, but it is slightly different, and it has these incredible, it's absolutely beautiful, these incredible Celtic drawings, art. It really takes from the Celtic influence. We also have these crosses in Ireland that have, you'll know them if you've ever been here, they're a cross, but they've also got this kind of round shape in the centre. They're often stone crosses, and that round shape, that is taken from our kind of Celtic history as well, and that represents the sun, which was incredibly important to the Celts because they were a farming people. They would have really revered the sun. You can see that reflected as well in a lot of our Celtic festivities. Bonfires are a really big part of these festivities, as are fireworks, but we think that fire was probably a representation of the sun because of how fundamental and how important it would have been to these people. Another really interesting point here is that Rome did not like that Ireland was practicing Christianity in the way that it was. The irony being that Ireland and Irish monks actually spread Christianity oftentimes throughout Europe. But I digress. Basically, in and around the 12th century, Pope at the time, who by the way was an English Pope, and that's important, used Ireland's kind of way of Christianity as a an excuse to say to, I think it was King Henry II, not the fifth, not the guy with the heads, but the guy before him. There's too many. They've got all the same names. Anyway, I give you permission effectively to colonise Ireland. I'm sure he didn't use the word colonise, but he effectively gave him the church's permission to go into Ireland, take over Ireland, with the condition that England would, that Britain would transform our Christianity into the Roman Catholic Church's form of Christianity, which was aligned and decidedly not pagan. So we have the Roman Christian Church to thank in part for the colonization of this country as well, which is just absolutely, it's abhorrent. It's so awful to think of. And when you think of that as well, like, once that happened, I mean, we've got them to thank probably for all of the other stuff that happened under the Catholic Church's rule here as well. I know that's an oversimplification, right? But we went from a people who would not and were not really interested in burning witches to a people who locked women up in laundries as kind of modern day slaves, right? That's quite a stark contrast. So I think it's fair to say that that colonialism, both the British kind and the Christian kind, played a big role in that. But I digress. Effectively the moral of the story is that because Ireland had this very rich fairy lore, and because we were effectively terrified of fairies, right? Terrified of being taken away, of being made ill, of being possessed. It was the fairies that we were focused on. When everyone else was executing and trialing witches, we were the ones saying, you guys have it all wrong. It's not the witches at all. The witches are grand. It's the fairies. The fairies are the ones that are responsible for all of this carry-on, all of our woes, not the witches. In fact, witches played a central role in Irish communities for keeping fairies away. So it's just, it all comes back to fairies. And that is why that's why we didn't partake. That's why witch burnings were, despite us being a very Christian country at the time, Ireland really did not partake in witch burnings. There is the story of Bridget Cleary, which I know My Favourite Murder did an episode on that. I'll link it in the show notes there. And that's an interesting one, because actually that is kind of considered colloquially to be a witch burning, but that's not what it was. And first of all, it was a quote-unquote fairy possession, but secondly, the man who burned her husband, he was imprisoned for doing that. That was not seen as a state-sanctioned witch burning. So I don't think it's fair really to call that one a witch burning. That was really just out and out murder, right? But My Favourite Murder did a really good episode on that. I'll link that. And then also the Irish History podcast did a really good episode on Alice Keitler and Petrolina of Meath. So I'll link that in the show notes as well, because he goes really, really in depth into that story. So that's that, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. This did not go off to a great start. I was hours trying to film this video, but I thought, look, I'm just going to push through it. I'm going to see how it goes. Let me know if you enjoy the YouTube side of things, the podcast side of things. I know that TikTok is great for short form content, but it can be a little bit tricky to kind of come back to. So I think maybe a podcast or a YouTube might be quite handy for that. But yeah, let me know what you think. Gurv mila mahagat. Oh, and also, I am still doing the book club. We're still on this book because she's quite thick, right? So we're giving her kind of due time, due credit. But this is an absolutely excellent book. It's written by Joe Kerrigan. I'll have the link for the book club in the bio, but this talks about a lot of the stuff that I've mentioned in this video as well. So it goes into our Celtic past, it goes into druids, it goes into our fire festivals, so Samhain, Imbolc, Bealtaine and Lunasa, and so much more. It goes into Irish gods and goddesses. It's absolutely a fantastic read. So if you're interested in joining the book club, I will put the link for that in the bio as well. If you don't want to pay for that, you can just join my Substack newsletter, and that is completely free. And that just means I'll have your email. I'll send you out the newsletter kind of once a month or so, so that you don't miss any updates. All right, gur míle maith agat, slán go fóill, and until next time. Okay, bye.